Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, I want to talk a little bit about a trend I hear from a lot of folks that come in to see me. And personally, I would agree. I experience a little bit of myself. Now, do note there's a little bit of a selection bias because I'm talking about people who are coming to therapy. But for what it's worth, the sentiment I hear is how difficult it is to socialize and to gain intimacy with other people. That there is this collective desire to connect with one another, but a lot of people not willing to do the requisite work to actually meaningfully connect. How this plays out in the therapy room, what I often hear is like, I am putting forth the effort, I am reaching out, but I feel like there's not a lot of reciprocation. Now, this cannot be a fully universal mentality because otherwise it's a bunch of people saying the same thing, and that's not how life works. Somebody is probably putting forth more effort than another person. So again, maybe the people coming in for therapy are more invested in growth and intentional change than the average Joe. And thereby there is this sort of extra impetus to reach out that people who are not seeking therapy but still desire connection that they don't have, they're just not putting forth as much effort, and they might just think that they are. I don't know, I don't see these people. Now, there's also the other potential that people are allowed to have full social circles, and a full social circle runs the gamut. Someone can be absolutely content with one or two relationships, or they might be absolutely content with 10. But if the social circle is relatively full, well, yeah, if I am reaching out and I'm not part of that more inner circle for that person, they don't have the bandwidth to reach back out, well, maybe, they don't have space for me, and that's totally okay. But again, the frequency at which I hear this leads me to believe that is not the default case, that there's a bunch of people with complete social circles. Au contraire, my general sense is there's a lot of people, again, that actually would like more connection, but there's a disconnect in how we are connecting. So what the hell is that about is essentially the question. Now, this is speculative. I've not looked at research. I don't even know if there is research, but my general sense is a few things. One, I am sure it would be of surprise to no one that the internet landscape has absolutely changed how we communicate with one another. That there is an element of connection in doing so, and I mean in doing so, it could be anything, older school kind of Facebook stuff, to Instagram, to TikTok, to emails, to whatever it might be. There is this ability to connect, but it is not the same level of intimacy as real life connection. We even talk about this in the field, that even the shift to telehealth-based therapy deletes a component, doesn't delete, I should say, shifts a component that just isn't quite the same as in person. Now, I think we do ourselves a disservice is to assume that, chatting on Discord or, interacting by sharing clips on TikTok is completely empty and has no meaning whatsoever. It's still an approximation of connection, but it is simply not fully the same. And so it is possible what is happening is I talk about this in the world of fantasy. When we meet a need part way, it satiates the need in a way that doesn't give us, or doesn't result in enough energy to do the full thing, right? So because I posted on Facebook, or because I sent that email, or because I texted this person, that quote unquote meets the need, even though it's not really deeply satiating that need. And so it erases the need momentarily, and the need returns, and we do this sort of quasi reaching out ad nauseum, but we're not really meeting those deeper connections, and it gets us into a little bit of a spiral, or a little bit of a trap, where we're only quasi meeting our needs because there is this extra layer. We just don't have the energy to do or take it the rest of the way. If you're curious what I meant about the fantasy world, one of the beauties of fantasy is we can engage ourselves and our needs, our values, our wants in a way that doesn't require real life replication. But the danger of living in fantasy, if we live in fantasy for far too long, is it satiates the idea of actually translating fantasy into reality, that there might actually be components of our fantasy that require us to engage in them. But if we just live out the fantasies constantly internally, that sort of potential, that need to exercise it decreases substantially. And so we have to have a careful relationship with our fantasy world. We cannot get lost in fantasy. Just as what I'm saying, we cannot get lost in the sort of quasi-real but quasi-faux connection that social media and text and stuff like that gives us. So that is one potential theory, that we really haven't found a way to adapt to the internet world, because it is like a conduit connection to connection, but it we kind of gaslight ourselves into believing that it is sufficient. Theory number 2 is becomes a little bit more generationally focused, not because I think any one generation is to blame. We're all kind of subject to our own sort of circumstances. And so, like, COVID was a big one. It really, I think, upended what social connection meant for people. There was, if you recall, there was this sort of moment where people were like, I am enjoying the freedom of not connecting with people. It's sort of like intensity of social interaction. But unfortunately, in excess, it gave us sort of an escapist mentality. And even for myself, with a lot of social anxiety, I'm talking a lot of social anxiety growing up, it kind of reset something deep inside me, where I felt very awkward interacting with people again. And that's coming from a therapist, right? A psychologist that sees people for a living. So, it definitely steered me away from that extra sort of bravery and necessity to connect with people, which, I'm 41. I grew up in a time that internet did not exist to connect with people. I had to put in the requisite work. Now, social anxiety sabotaged that, but, it's not like I've only known internet connection. So even for me to fall back into that, I think was very powerful and very important. And I've heard this from other people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, that there was not necessarily a reset switch, but COVID messed with us to a certain degree. I think there's also a lot of existential dread floating around. So generationally, it's really interesting. We have what seems to be a younger generation that is truly having a challenge connecting with one another. Whether it's communicating directly and openly about one's emotions, which is really curious because they're the most prone, it seems, generation to actually seek therapy. Yet at the same time, the actual communication skill set isn't always there. So there's maybe something going on there that's kind of curious, but it feels like just this. Just like this macro zeitgeist, right? Like zeitgeist is this like overall, think of it as almost like the culture of existence. And there's this like dread and powerlessness and uncertainty that when that exists inside of us, it kicks in more of like a survival mentality rather than more of a bravery, thrive, engage, take risks mentality. And so prospectively, that's pulling people away from the activity that would usually allow us to more meaningfully connect with one another. And then you combine that with the ability to quasi-connect. Again, I'm not trying to diminish. I mean, I do lots of quote-unquote quasi-connecting with people. But those two kind of act in tandem. They collude with one another and disinclines people to engage. So that's, generational contextual sort of issue. There's also a lot of just conflict in the world, that there is aggression and hostility and a lack of safety, which further spurs on that kind of point around survival mechanisms. Why would I want to go out and take the risk? I can consciously all day long say like, yeah, of course I want to make a new friend. That would be a great thing. But emotionally, that might be a very different story, that in that very moment, that sort of impetus to go out is squelched by like, but it's more comfortable here. I'd rather sit on my couch. Also within this, maybe, I don't know if it's 0.3, I don't know. Let's see what I timestamp this stuff for. But, coming to mind in this moment was like, we also have so many methods of experiential avoidance in this world. So many methods. The internet is a black hole for this. I mean, it is a world and full of just a wealth of information and the potential to connect, but it is also just this black hole that we can get sucked into. This is the creation of the adage. I don't know if adage is the right word, but the phrase doom scrolling. You can literally be doom scrolling on your phone, or just delving into internet searches or articles or YouTubes or TikToks, whatever it might be. We get sucked into this, and when we experientially avoid, we get disconnected from our emotional selves and our needs, and because of that, it's an easy out. It's an easy pull that, like, when I'm at my best self, I'm like, what I would love to do is this. But at the end of the day, when I'm sitting on my couch, what I actually end up doing? Well, I'm quote unquote doom scrolling. And so I think, I think that's most of it. I think, well, I mean, there's political divides. There's people who just feel diametrically opposed, and that disinclines people. But I think all of these things collectively, they just demotivate people. And so when you have someone who's like, I'm trying the best I can to reach out, and I'm just not being successful. I try to communicate to folks, like, we don't know what's on the minds of the people who aren't receiving you. It could be rejection. I mean, I don't like to provide kind of undue comfort and not acknowledge the potential not so savory possibilities. I mean, those are indeed possibilities. It could be rejection. They didn't like you. They don't want to associate with you. Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, that's a possibility. But it also could be this, right? Gesticulate wildly about all those things I just spoke about. It could be all that. And so we have to be careful not to take it personally and to not demotivate ourselves, because that extra effort is likely required to bust through those components. That is not an easy endeavor to push through when people are disinclined, potentially for a variety of reasons, to be active in the socializing process. That puts a lot of onus on the person trying to do that work. And so what I essentially say to people is, like, there is a resiliency you need to build around this if you are to continue. There is you need to work on rejection sensitivity, because there is an extra layer and dynamic that might not be at play here. That, yeah, we might have been able to be more confident in that assertion 30 years ago, but in the present day and age, taking it personally is going to be a very dangerous thing, because then you will become potentially another person just as disinclined to engage and put yourself out there. So, the only other factor that I might want to mention is not factor, but like the other dynamic is like, it's hard to make friends as an adult. I just think it's true. I think it's always been the case, even before the advent of the internet and social media and that kind of stuff. I think it's just tough. It's just tough to do. What I often remind folks of is, like, when we're in school and extracurricular activities, if you're involved in them therein, it is, we best meet each other through communal shared efforts and endeavors. And there are way more of those earlier in our lives than later in our lives. Those that are later in our lives are much more not relegated. There's just fewer. The one exception, I think, is having kids. Like, when you have kids, you're kind of tossed back into spaces with fellow adults where you could, it's like, well, our kids are interacting. I guess that's our segue, right? For us to interact too. But outside of that, there's, like, any organized experience, there's just less of them. Again, a lot of them are transported to online, the old school way of meeting at bookstores and stuff, right? Just, it's not as common as much, on top of all the other stuff I had just mentioned. So there's, like, organized religion and church is one methodology. Parenthood and communal events for kids, like I said, that's a big one for a lot of adults. Travel, sports, any sort of organized activity, but it's just not as constantly baked in. And that's where the advent of like meetup and those sorts of things became a thing. It's like, well, I know these other people exist, but can we specifically schedule knowing that part of the goal is to meet up and socialize while doing the thing? Because it just doesn't as organically happen anymore. And so it's hard to make friends as an adult. And if you're listening and you're getting into your 30s and 40s and you don't have a kid yet, it is especially hard, I think, in those circumstances. And I hear that from childless adults. They're like, I start losing contacts because I got to find other people that don't necessarily have kids. Not because I can't be friends with people who have kids, but there's, you have to orchestrate. It's harder to organize around that because because we don't have kids that can share the time. They've got to organize around childcare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the only additional point. Forgive me if it was a little bit belabored. I think that's the only additional point I would make, that regardless of the first portion, which is like, hey, there's something unique going on that seems to be making it hard for people to socialize and build relationships. Let me be clear. I think adulthood is always a lot harder to make friends than when we're kids and adolescents and young adults. So, for whatever that's worth. I'm curious what other people think, what other people's experiences are. Just because this is what I hear in the context of a psychologist doesn't mean it's a shared sentiment amongst everyone. So, as much as I don't like doing the like and subscribe comment below, I would be interested if anybody has thoughts on this, what your thoughts might be. So, as always, thank you for listening and watching, and stay curious.